Hey guys, welcome to chapter 6. I'm sorry we skipped 5. This class is very cramped because we try to teach micro and macro. Chapter 5 has some really cool stuff about elasticity, important concept. My job as a data scientist right now, I'm actually working on a model that estimates like thousands of different elasticities in different markets. They're paying me a lot of money to update a model that does that. Like it's a thing. People care about it. Anyway, we don't get to talk about it in this class, but you can do that chapter for extra credit if you want to, the EOC. It's good all the way up until the last day of lectures this semester. Anyway, chapter 6, we're going to shift gears. We're going to leave supply and demand behind-ish. And today we're just talking about what's behind the supply curve. We're going to talk about cost functions. And my favorite way to talk about cost functions is talking about video games. So, story from my childhood. It's the mid 1990s. And previously, all video games are on plastic cassettes. Or at least currently, all video games are on these plastic cassettes. You might have seen the old cartridges, like at your grandpa's house or something. I don't know. Yeah, the old Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the N64, like that kind of stuff. And then Sony decided to enter the video game market for the first time. And they are dead set on doing it with a CD. Now, why would you want a compact disc instead of a cassette? One, it's cheaper to print. Two, it holds more memory. So you can have a more like advanced game, both in terms of game content, but it can also have like a nice soundtrack. None of like the Mario beeping noise, but like actual music. So you can have a better game with music and it's cheaper to make. That became the future of gaming, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So they decided to enter. But Nintendo was this giant juggernaut. And I mean, Sega's there too. Sega had the Dreamcast and Sega Genesis and some other stuff. Like Sega's been around too. You might not have heard of Sega now because this showdown between the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn ends really bad for Sega. Okay. By the way, I'm borrowing this story from one of my favorite podcasts. It's called Business Wars. It's fantastic. You do not have to be an economist to listen to it. It's meant for a general audience, but they just tell really cool business stories of ways that firms have competed with each other. It's fascinating. I love it. Business Wars podcast. Strongly recommend it. All right. Now, back to Sony. So Sony makes this compact disc game or system, but they don't have any games. No one's heard of, like, no one wants to design a super nice game for Sony because Sony's just some like new upstart. They'd rather make something for Nintendo and have a guaranteed massive audience and make tons of money. So Sony goes around to a whole boatload of game makers and shows them a video. Or it's not a video, it's a game. The people can get on their controller and they can drive around this T-Rex. Now this video I'm showing you is from 1997. This is 25 years ago. And the graphics you are seeing, no one could believe it. I mean, the last thing they saw was like Mario just jumping up and down over mushrooms. And these Sony people show up and say, check out this dinosaur you can drive around in 3D. Look how realistic he is. He's awesome. All right. Blew people's freaking minds. And all of a sudden, some of the best game makers in the world are realizing the potential here. Real music, cool graphics, 3D frameworks. Okay. The world is excited about the Sony PlayStation. Sega panics. Okay. Sony's been working on this project for years, making it cost effective, building up their setup, getting it ready for mass production. Sega sees it and they panic and they decide they're going to get out their own version of CD games that'll be ready in a year, which, hey, maybe. So they do it. They built the Sega Saturn in a year. And the funny thing is it arguably had better graphics and better speed than the Sony PlayStation. It's arguably a better system. So why, if Sony and Sega made these two consoles at roughly the same time, they hit the market pretty similar with each other, they're considered like same generation, why did Sega die while Sony lives if Sega made a better console? And it has to do with costs. See, Sony spent a lot of time and money and research early as a fixed cost. This big upfront thing they had to pay. And as a result of it, they got really good at making the PlayStation where each unit they produced was cheap. Sega, on the other hand, had a very low fixed cost. They didn't research it for years. They just threw some engineers at it and said, go, go, go for a year. Much lower startup cost. But as a result, their console was more expensive to make per unit. I think if I remember the details correctly, the Sony had a single computer processor in it. That's the most expensive part. The Sega Saturn had four times as many of the most expensive bit. So that explains why it's faster and why it has better graphics. But it's also way more expensive to make each unit. And I don't know if you've ever followed video game markets before, but they always end in a price war. The two companies will start out at their high price. And then once the market sort of slows down at those prices, they lower their price to get new customers. They lower the price to get new customers. And eventually they bottom out. And it's just a big slog after that, where they just capture as many as they can at the lowest price possible. But Sony had the advantage in the price war. You see, they could go all the way down to Sega's minimum price, where Sega's making $0 per console, and Sony's still making money for every console sold. Because their marginal cost, their next unit cost, is always lower. So I think that is a great starting story for the cost chapter. Because costs are going to tell us a lot about supply, and they're also going to tell us a lot about the market and what the market's going to look like. So briefly, fixed costs. Those are the costs that have nothing to do with per unit construction or building or producing. They are just there. For your average store, you can picture being like your monthly rent and any sort of like business fees and stuff like that, where you have to pay those bills whether or not you're in business. Variable costs are the costs that depend on how much stuff you actually make. So your labor, your ingredients, your fuel, your resources, those things are all variable costs. Now, marginal cost is the change in cost that comes from producing one more unit of the good. So marginal cost is tied in closely with variable cost. We usually assume that marginal cost is increasing, although in a lot of examples, it's got like a Nike swoosh thing where it starts by decreasing and then it starts increasing and keeps increasing forever. We can mess with that. You can have flat marginal costs. You can have straight upward sloping marginal costs. You can have them stair step. You can do all kinds of weird things. Maybe in an intermediate class, we can dig more into that. For now, we'll stick mostly with our swoops and straight lines. Anyway, so some ideas of how this can help us know something about a market. If you have a market with low fixed costs, That might go back to a competitive market where there has to be where in order for there to be lots of firms, it has to be easy for them to get in the market. And if there's imagine an extreme case of no fixed costs, that means anybody can sell whenever they want to, and when they don't want to, they don't have to. That is a recipe for lots of sellers. If, on the other hand, you have an industry where there's a huge startup cost, that probably will keep a lot of sellers out of the market. See, the cost structure can tell us a lot about what kind of competition to expect. Will it be perfect competition, like a supply and demand graph? Or will it be something else, like this Sony versus Sega, where it's a couple of huge companies in a market with very few companies smashing up against each other competitively and strategically? That's called oligopoly, but we'll save that for later. Yeah. So this cost chapter, I think it's interesting. I gave you a couple of videos, not a ton, because it's pretty straightforward, I think. There are some equations to get comfortable with. Strongly recommend working your way through that video where I solve a cost table for you. That's one of my most viewed ones because people need help with that. Let's see, a couple of other ideas in here though. You're also going to run into a concept called economies of scale. Now, economies of scale is also one that I find interesting. It has to do with the size of a firm and its average costs. Oh yeah, you're going to learn all kinds of stuff about average costs too, but I'm going to let you do that in the other videos. Yeah. So with economies of scale, we switch to the long run. Now, one thing I didn't emphasize a minute ago is that fixed costs only exist in the short run. In the short run, I might be locked into a lease that I have to pay my rent every month. In the long run, once my lease expires, I can get a bigger store with a more expensive rent. I can shut down and not have a rent. Okay, what was fixed becomes variable, something I can choose. So in the long run, we actually assume that there are no fixed costs. And that's what defines the long run, is that everything's variable. There's not a specific years to that. It just depends. Okay, I'm not going to tell you it's X number of years because it's not that. What it is just long enough that you don't have any fixed costs, that everything's flexible. And this long run average cost curve is going to tell us something about the size of a company and how effective it is. So the long run average cost curve is usually this big U-shaped, but it could just be a one way or the other way. I don't know. Don't worry about it. Actually, do worry about it because you got to learn it. But I have a video about it, so worry about it then. Anyway, something I find interesting is, again, this cost structure being something that can help drive our business competition. You can come to it from this angle also. See, industries with high fixed costs and low marginal costs, kind of like what Sony did here, those favor larger firms. The big firm can pay all the upfront big costs and then mass produce with lots and lots of itty bitty marginal costs, and overall we'll have a smaller average cost. Now, this is true in farming, where the big farm operations will buy multi-million-dollar vehicles, these huge things you can drive around, and they're GPS, and they have all these data that's being collected on it. It knows where it planted its seeds and how much seeds it planted and where it put the fertilizer and how much it sprayed, and it stores all that information. And then when it harvests, it says how much it harvests, and then that all feeds through a bunch of algorithms. And so next year it sprays a better amount of fertilizer in different places. Okay, that's an expensive machine. It costs a lot of money. There's a boatload of data scientists who work on farm tractors or harvesters or whatever they're called. Uh, but once you have that set up, getting an ear of corn or a bushel of apples or whatever it is you're doing is really cheap compared to your competitors. And so, why do we see large industrial farming operations? They have lower average costs, which means they can sell their goods cheaper than smaller farms can. Um, you might call this the Walmart effect. When you look at economies of scale and you see this U shape, the idea is for a while as a firm gets bigger, its costs fall, its average costs fall. That's called economies of scale. Now, eventually, there's a point where as the firm gets bigger, it gets less efficient and costs start rising. That's called diseconomies of scale. But that bottom area, that minimum efficient scale thing, that bottom of the U shape, that's the sweet spot. That's where you want to be if you're running a business, because that is where you've got the lowest possible average cost. And I call it the Walmart effect because Walmart is the master of this. Why is Walmart such a job killer? I mean, it's a job creator too. Lots of people work there. Why does it kill the local mom and pop shops? Because Walmart shows up way bigger than them, has this huge global supply chain, and they're big enough that they can argue with their suppliers for lower costs. And so Walmart gets better cost deals than the mom and pop shops. And then Walmart can sell its goods cheaper than the mom and pop shops. And then the rest of us in town, as much as we like to think we support local businesses or whatever, ultimately, when it comes time to pay with our budget and our actual dollars, we often go to Walmart. So those are just a few thoughts that I think fit in with this lecture. We're just learning about costs. There's a lot of equations and a lot of stuff, but it's just trying to explain some very fundamental things. It's trying to explain what's going on behind a company's supply curve. Next week and the week after, we're going to hang on to this stuff. We're going to keep these cost functions, especially the average ones and the marginal one. But we're going to keep these cost functions, and we're going to start throwing prices and demand curves on them to explain how a competitive firm behaves versus how a monopoly firm behaves. And then later, when you go to intermediate micro, we might even do some cases in between those, which is my favorite place. Anyway, I think that's good enough for today, guys. I hope it's helpful. Don't forget, we do have discussion forums. Don't forget, you do have office hours, live ones with the TA, or you can message me and set up a meeting. Discussion forum should be your first go-to, though, because lots of people have the same questions. And yeah, I think it's a cool chapter. Good luck. Don't forget to check out the Business Wars podcast. It's pretty dope, man. It's pretty awesome. Peace.